Thank you very much. Thank you, Grace, for organizing the session, and thanks for coming. I'll just summarize a little bit what we do at PLOS to advance data sharing, and also how we are part of the larger community in publishing, how we can drive data sharing together. So first of all, this is our data policy. All our journals require authors to make all data underlying the findings described in the manuscript fully available without restriction and only with rare exceptions. So when submitting a manuscript online, authors must provide a data availability statement describing the compliance with our policy. So important here is that the data underlying the findings in the paper itself needs to be shared, which does not necessarily mean all the raw data, but just those related to the presented data. And the second part is the data availability statement that summarizes where the data can be accessed and that it is actually also presented in the paper. We have the policy since March 2014. And some of the exceptions that we have for the policy are, for example, ethical or legal reasons where patient confidentiality or privacy would be affected. It could be in clinical trials, it could be in social sciences studies. There's other issues where some of the data cannot be put online, for example, locations of fossils, endangered species, or other reasons. In that case, data can be obtained from the authors or may not necessarily need to be put up in a repository or in the supplementary information of a paper. The way it looks, and it's similar also at Nature, is that we have the statement. It's part of the metadata. You can search it via our API. It explains where the data is. It links to the repository if it is in a repository, and it's part of the header of the paper, if you like. So since we have the policy since March 2014, we have more than 96,000 papers published across the journals with this statement, approaching fast 100,000 papers. Only a very, very small fraction of submissions are rejected due to the author's unwillingness to share the data. That was initially one of the questions that people asked: would authors not be willing to share the data? But at least those that end up submitting to our journals, the vast majority of them are fine with this. 23% of submissions use data repositories, which is good, but at the same time it also could be higher, obviously. The number has been increasing a little bit. It also has been increased before, from the situation before our data policy was in place. So compliance or sharing via data repositories is increasing. I should also add that this number might actually be slightly higher, because what we do, if someone submits supplementary information, we also upload this to Figshare, so to a repository where the data can be found. So it's not just on the page of the article on our homepage where you can find this type of data. But we certainly like to encourage the use of data repositories more, and like to increase this number if possible. So the policy itself already can make a lot of difference. As I mentioned, 96,000 papers published under this policy. This is a study that was published last year that shows basically how journals implement data availability and data sharing. And sort of there's different flavors of it, and it's probably too small to read, but the darker the blue, the more stringent the policy is. So the first row just shows journals in the area studied, where, for example, data sharing is required as a condition of publication. Across journals, it's only around 12%. If you look at citable items, so that means the actual number of articles, that's the second row, including +1, you can see that this increases to 33% of articles in citable items in these journals studied require data sharing as a matter of fact upon publication. But if you remove +1 out of the equation with the large volume of articles that we publish, then this falls back to 11.3%, the dark blue box on the left. So data sharing, at least for the biomedical field, a journal like +1 with a high volume of published papers can make a large difference in the uptake and implementation of data policies in some of the subject areas. So for the second part of my talk, I just like to also describe a little bit about an initiative that the American Geophysical Union is organizing, and I'm sharing this with their permission, how journals can move forward, or publishers can move forward along with repositories to advance data sharing and to make this even more common and more of a standard for researchers. And this obviously then concerns Earth and space sciences in itself. So the AGU, the American Geophysical Union, got a grant from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to align publishers and repositories to enable fair and open data sharing, in the hope that this will accelerate scientific discovery and enhance the transparency and reproducibility of data. So what's obviously important to this is what also all the others mentioned already are the FAIR guiding principles. So FAIR is an acronym meaning findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So these are the principles of meaningful data sharing that actually can make an impact on those that like to share the data. So what this project aims to is that the data repositories are all compliant with these kind of FAIR principles, that they provide metadata, landing pages, make the data discoverable, support researchers, and obviously also support citation of the data, which is important in order to give credit to researchers, and obviously also data curation. So, so the repository side of this project, these repositories will aim to work according to these principles. And the same for publishers that are taking part in this group, including PLOS. And there the publishers also aim to align their policies to establish a similar experience for researchers. The data will be available through citations that go to these kind of repositories. And ideally, the data should not be placed in the supplement, at least no primary data. So that also, again, moves away from the supplement to information as sort of a data dump to meaningful data sharing via repositories. So working together with repositories and publishers, I think this is a kind of exciting initiative, at least for this particular field, to advance data sharing in a practical way with joint criteria, policies, and implementation. It follows similar implementation what we already do at PLOS, but it's exciting to see other publishers interested at least in signing up to something like this. So for journals, what we've been discussing so far in this working group is obviously that all data should be open and accessible at the time of publication. And again, operating open according to the FAIR principles. All core research output should be directed to trusted repositories that follow these FAIR principles. I also like to emphasize that this policy, I mean, we talk about data, that includes also, to some degree, software, samples, and sample descriptions. So it's not just bits that we're talking about. It could also be code. It could be physical samples, especially in the earth sciences, or sample descriptions. And obviously, again, as I mentioned before, supplements should not be used as a primary archive for data. The journals taking part also aim to adopt a shared set of author instructions that guide authors to support these principles. And then, at least for the earth, space, and environmental sciences, create a common set of expectations so that authors in this particular area know exactly how they should prepare the data or where the data should go And it doesn't really matter what journal they're aiming for to publish a paper in or submit a paper to, but they instead then don't have to worry about the data policy being different between journals. And then obviously the same for publication peer review. When evaluating whether this data and metadata are adequate. So obviously all the reviewers should be asked whether they believe that the data sharing is sufficient. And last but not least, there's going to be also an aim towards at least eventually arrive at a common workflow for data citations. So if you're interested, I mean, this is all still under discussion, but there is a link to the commitment statement, at least a draft to it, where you can have a look. And as I said, I find it an exciting kind of scheme to work together as a community in a particular area to advance data sharing and to make it also easier for authors to share the data. So that's it, my contribution for the discussion. Thank you.